Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take stacks of complex research, history books, genetic studies, all that, and try to distill it into something memorable, something profound.
And today, we are really diving deep into an identity that's, well, often misunderstood, frequently erased, and scientifically just fascinating: bisexuality.
Yeah, the sources you brought today give an extraordinary look at its history, the culture around it, and the science of sexual fluidity.
And our mission today, it's drawn right from the material itself. We want to challenge that foundational assumption, the idea that heterosexuality is the default, the sort of baseline for human experience.
Exactly. The goal is to, as one source puts it, clear our worldview by destabilizing our assumptions about sex and sexuality.
It's a really essential mission, I think, because, just the decades of research, decades of activism, the conversation often gets shut down.
Right. You hear that pushback like in publishing circles where people are told, oh, we've already had that conversation about bisexuality.
And that dismissal, it implies identity is simple, like something you can just file away neatly.
But the research we're looking at today, the sheer volume and complexity, it just proves that these conversations about identity, about love, attraction, they're fundamental. They're never really over, are they?
Never. So over the next half hour or so, we'll dig into how this identity has been measured, often pretty controversially, it turns out.
We'll look at the long history of bisexual erasure, both, within and outside queer spaces.
Yeah, and the latest science on fluidity, which really challenges this idea of monosexuality as the biological default.
And finally, the very real costs, societally speaking, but also the profound freedom that can come with identifying as bi today.
Okay, let's get into it. Where do we start? Maybe with the biggest hurdle for researchers.
Yeah.
How do you even define, let alone measure, something as fluid as identity?
Yeah, the definition problem. The sources, especially historian Hannah Blank's work, really hammer this home. Historically, in English-speaking cultures anyway, people didn't really think of sexuality as an identity, right? Not core to who they were.
Exactly. It was seen more as something people did,
Uh,
sexual behavior, not something intrinsic, not an innate part of them.
And that confusion, that mix-up between behavior and identity, it's crucial, isn't it? Because if society just focuses on the acts, not the person's sense of self.
It makes researching complex identities like bisexuality incredibly difficult. And that confusion, it absolutely persists today.
So modern researchers, they're forced to create these, what are they called, operational definitions?
Right, operational definitions. They're kind of a necessary evil in science, trying to quantify something abstract.
Oh.
But, well, they can go spectacularly wrong.
Like that 2020 study on bisexual men. That one caused quite a stir.
Oh, yeah. Highly criticized.
Mm.
The researchers seemed, I don't know, determined to pin down the identity physically.
So what was the method? I remember reading about this. It involved a specific device.
The penile plethysmograph.
Yeah.
Basically, a mechanical sleeve strapped around the penis.
Wow. Okay.
And they used it to monitor physical blood flow, arousal, while the participants watched different kinds of porn: gay porn and straight porn.
That sounds, well, invasive for one, but also really reductionist, scientifically speaking. What were they trying to prove?
Their stated goal was to find a specific pattern, equal physical arousal to both types of stimuli, to get beyond self-reporting, provide some kind of biological proof that bisexual men really existed.
And after running the study, which didn't they admit it was in an unnatural situation?
They did concede that, yes. But they still claimed they'd finally settled the matter,
Like-
found the proof.
But the backlash, the academic critique that followed, it suggested they'd kind of proved the opposite point, didn't it?
Precisely. The critique, published the next year, basically argued the methodology showed a superficial understanding of the concept of sexual orientation, a really fundamental misunderstanding,
What was the core argument against it?
that sexuality is an identity. And identity doesn't require a specific, measurable physical response.
Mhm.
Your sense of self isn't dictated by, blood flow in a lab.
That's a powerful point. And it's not just academic theory, right? The sources connect this to anti-discrimination law.
Yeah, absolutely. They point out that laws in the UK, Canada, Germany, the US, they already embody this idea. Your identity isn't contingent on specific behaviors or physical responses.
So if you identify as bisexual, you are bisexual, regardless of what some machine says in a weird lab setting.
Exactly. Using a plethysmograph to prove identity,
Yeah.
critique argues, is basically a refusal to accept self-identification. It misses the whole point of what identity is.
Okay, so measuring arousal doesn't cut it, but way before this modern tech, there was one piece of research that just blew the doors off the old binary thinking, the Kinsey scale.
Ah, Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey. A zoologist, a taxonomist first, actually. He was driven by this desire to classify, to describe the world scientifically, like he did with gall wasps.
Well, wasp.
Yeah. And he wanted to connect human sexuality back to what he called its mammalian background. His scale, from the late 40s, early 50s, it's absolutely the grandfather of sexuality research.
And it's pretty simple on the surface. 0, totally heterosexual, to 6, totally homosexual,
Right.
plus the X for asexuality. What made it so radical back then?
Well, think about the time, mid-20th century. Non-heterosexuality was widely seen as pathological. A sickness, a crime, a sin. Kinsey just stripped all that away.
The moral judgment.
Completely. He presented every number on his scale, 0 through 6, as equally good and healthy. Just variations. It was this revolutionary refusal to pathologize difference.
And when you actually look at the scale, 0 to 6, the sources make a really interesting point that often gets missed.
Which is,
How much of that scale is technically bisexual space?
right, 5 out of the 7 options. Everything from 1 to 5. It falls within what the source calls the bisexual universe. Kinsey wasn't just observing it. He was implicitly normalizing it as the numerical majority of his own spectrum.
And his findings, the actual data, back this up, right?
Massively. His 1948 report on men. Almost half the guys reported some level of same-sex desire or experience. That's huge.
Almost half. Wow.
In the 1953 report on women, it was similar. Between 11 and 20% of unmarried women, 8 to 10% of married women, reported same-sex desires or experiences.
So his work fundamentally challenged the whole idea of fixed labels, gay or straight, full stop.
Absolutely. He was explicit. He called the heterosexual-homosexual binary ridiculous, said it just didn't reflect behavior as it actually occurs in the human being.
So what did he propose instead?
Endless intergradation, a spectrum, a fluidity. This is why his work is still so potent today. He essentially framed bisexuality not as the exception, but maybe even the foundational norm from which monosexuality derived.
That just flips everything on its head. If you take Kinsey seriously, the question isn't, why is someone bi? The question becomes, why is anyone exclusively monosexual?
Exactly. It shifts the burden of explanation. Monosexuality becomes the thing needing the explanation, not fluidity. But, the Kinsey scale, for all its impact, was criticized. Too simple, maybe.
Yeah, it didn't capture complexity, like how desire changes over time or how behavior and fantasy might not line up.
Right, and that's where the Klein grid came in later. Fritz Klein developed it, trying to add more dimensions.
How did the Klein grid work?
It used 9 different parameters: attraction, behavior, fantasy, self-ID, things like that, and measured them across 3 time points: past, present, and ideal.
More nuanced.
Definitely. And crucially, Klein didn't just design it for scientists. It was a tool for psychologists, for patients, to structure those really complex conversations about sexuality, to get beyond just one number.
And that clinical focus allowed Klein to talk about the internal experience, didn't it? The potential conflict.
Yes. He actually used terms like the healthy bisexual, where identity and behavior felt aligned, versus the troubled bisexual.
Troubled.
Someone may be experiencing shame or conflict. Like, maybe they identified as straight but had bisexual behaviors or fantasies. The grid acknowledged that internal conflict was real, often driven by society's rigidity, not the sexuality itself.
Okay, so we have Kinsey showing massive fluidity decades ago, Klein adding complexity, yet there's still this huge gap, right? The stats and the sources show actual bisexual identification is still pretty low, like 0.5% to 3.1% in data from the 2000s.
That's the paradox, isn't it? Self-identification remains relatively low, but cultural acceptance of the idea of fluidity, the concept of a continuum, is surprisingly high.
What are the numbers on that?
60% of heterosexuals and 73% of homosexuals agree sexuality is a continuum. People seem to get the theory.
But there's always a but.
But, yeah, a significant chunk of the population, something like 20 to 28% of both straight and gay lesbian people, still believe there's no middle ground. You're either A or B.
That binary thinking just hangs on.
It really does. And that persistence, that belief in monosexuality is the only valid option. It's not just an academic point. It's the engine driving bisexual erasure.
That resistance, that no middle ground idea, it leads straight into this pattern we see in the sources. The media constantly rediscovering bisexuality as some kind of new trend.
Oh, it's like clockwork, isn't it?
Right.
Back in '74, Newsweek declared bisexual chic. Anyone goes. Flash forward 2 decades, 1995, same magazine, major cover story announcing bisexuality is this new sexual identity.
As if it hadn't existed in the 21 years between their own articles.
Exactly. And that 95 article, even though it acknowledged an independent bisexual movement, was out there.
It immediately fell back on old stereotypes.
Right. It got heavily criticized for basically mushing bisexuality together with polyamory, general promiscuity, gender fluidity, treating it less like a specific attraction and more like, I don't know, a symptom of modern sexual chaos.
Which really underlines why we need that historical perspective. David Halpern's point is so important here. Sex has no history. Sexuality, by contrast, does. Distinguishing acts from identity.
That's the absolute key dilemma for historians trying to track bi history. Because what often happens is historians look at past same-sex desire, maybe letters or diaries.
And they just reflexively label the people involved as gay or lesbian.
Automatically, systematically erasing anyone who might have been bisexual. It's an interpretive bias built right into the historical method sometimes.
The source gives that really clear modern example. The family friend who divorces her husband, starts dating a woman.
And boom, instant social consensus. She's a lesbian now, no questions asked. The possibility she might be bi just doesn't even enter the conversation for most people. It doesn't fit the neat story.
And this bias shapes the whole historical debate, doesn't it? Like, when did bi history actually begin?
Right. Does it start with the acts, like in ancient Greece or Rome, where behavioral bisexuality was common? Cantarella argues for that ancient origin.
Or does it only start when the identity, the label bisexual, gets formally constructed, much later, like 19th, 20th century?
If you only accept the identity starting point, you lose centuries of lived experience. It's a real problem.
But the label itself, bisexual, it did emerge relatively early in medical texts, partly thanks to Havelock Ellis, and his story is, well, it's pretty wild.
Ellis, yeah, 1859 to 1939, a real pioneer. His book Sexual Inversion is often called the first medical textbook on homosexuality and bisexuality in English.
And his personal life was unconventional for the time too, right?
Very. He was in an open marriage with Edith Lees, who was a women's rights activist, and he openly described her as largely homosexual.
But getting Sexual Inversion published was an absolute nightmare. How did it even see the light of day?
It was just one disaster after another. The first edition, destroyed. His co-author, Simons, had died, and Simons' family bought up the printing plates because they were terrified of the scandal.
Well, okay.
Then Ellis finds another publisher. They accept it, then reject it, worrying about its demoralizing influence.
And then it ends up with a fraudster.
Get this. Yeah. It finally gets published by this shady little press run by a guy calling himself Roland de Villiers. Real name, Georg Ferdinand Springmull von Weissenfeld.
Seriously.
Total charlatan. And de Villiers later killed himself when the police came knocking, partly because of the book being deemed obscene. Ellis himself faced legal trouble, public shaming, just for trying to research sex scientifically.
Incredible. But despite all that chaos, Ellis did make a positive contribution, didn't he? He helped popularize the actual term bisexual.
He did. It was a definite improvement over the ridiculous term they were using before, psychosexual hermaphrodite.
Oh my God.
Yeah, bisexual is much better. And he was progressive for his time in some ways. He acknowledged that same-sex attraction was widespread, even in people considered normally heterosexual. And he basically predicted Kinsey's stats decades earlier.
But he was also contradictory.
Deeply. He was influenced by Freud and psychoanalysis, which often saw bisexuality as like an immature phase you should grow out of.
Right. Resolve into monosexuality.
Exactly. So Ellis sometimes linked bisexuality to, criminality, mental illness. But then on the other hand, he'd turn around and attribute the success of great leaders and artists to their innately democratic attitude, which he tied directly to their bisexual nature.
So wrestling with the cultural anxieties of the time.
Completely. Fear on one side, fascination on the other.
And that history, that fear and pathologizing, it's what fueled the rise of activism in the 20th century. We often think of Stonewall as this monolithic gay event, but bisexual people were absolutely central to the queer movement, even if they get forgotten.
They were pivotal. Take Brenda Howard, known as Earth Girl, died on the anniversary of Stonewall, June 28th. She's widely credited as being key to originating the modern Pride March, but started as Christopher Street Day. Her organizing made that annual commemoration happen.
But even as queer spaces started forming after World War II, like the COC in the Netherlands, bisexuality was viewed with suspicion.
Immediately. There was tension right away. Bisexual people, especially if they had partners of different genders over time, or were currently partnered with someone to the opposite sex.
They got accused of sexual camouflage.
Exactly. This idea that they could just blend into straight society, hide their queerness when convenient, this passing privilege was seen as a threat, especially when gay and lesbian groups were fighting so hard for visibility as distinct from the straight norm.
And that tension really boiled over in the 70s in the gay liberation front.
Oh, yeah. In that movement, bisexuality was often equated to heterosexuality and straight politics, and thus dismissed. It was seen as betrayal.
Sleeping with the enemy.
That was the rhetoric. If you were attracted to more than one gender, you weren't seen as truly committed to the cause. This hostility, this belief that only exclusive attraction to one gender is valid. That's what the sources call monosexism.
Okay, so monosexism. The belief that only being gay or only being straight is legitimate, which erases or dismisses fluid identities like bisexuality.
Precisely. And that monosexism got weaponized within the queer community. Gay and lesbian activists sometimes use Kinsey's own scale against bi people, calling them partially straight, denying them full belonging.
And this division, particularly along gender lines, became incredibly painful during the AIDS crisis in the 80s.
Yeah, the experiences were starkly different. Some bi men found a kind of tragic solidarity, a community in tragedy, facing the epidemic alongside gay men.
But bi women.
Bi women often faced brutal exclusion from lesbian spaces. They were seen as ideologically suspect, maybe not real feminists, potential threats who might bring disease from men, labeled fence-sitters.
Just incredibly isolating. Rejected by the very community meant to be a refuge.
It was devastating for many, and that widespread biphobia, that monosexism coming from within queer spaces, was the direct catalyst for change. It forced bisexual people to say, okay, we need our own organizations, our own political infrastructure.
Which led to groups like BiPL.
Exactly. BiAPL, the first U.S. bisexual political action group, formed in 1983. A direct result of needing to fight for recognition and resources on two fronts, against homophobia from straight society and against biphobia from within the gay and lesbian community.
That fight for political recognition runs kind of parallel to the scientific quest to understand if sexuality is fixed or if that fluidity Kinsey saw is actually part of our biology. The early 90s were all about the hunt for the gay gene, right?
Yeah, that was huge. Geneticist Dean Hamer was leading that charge, focusing on a specific spot on the X chromosome, XQ28, which seemed linked to maternal inheritance patterns.
The idea was really compelling culturally. Find a gene, prove people are born this way, solidify identity in biology.
Right, but science, as we said, it self-corrects. And the correction that came with the massive 2019 DNA study was, well, enormous.
How big was that study?
Almost 500,000 participants.
Yeah.
Huge sample size. And the results were definitive. No single gay gene.
None at all.
Nope. Instead, they found genetics explains only a relatively small part of same-sex sexual behavior, somewhere between 8 and 25%. Multiple genes with tiny effects, plus environmental factors, much more complex.
And what did that study say about the Kinsey scale, about bisexuality?
Interestingly, the authors concluded that even Kinsey's scale, revolutionary as it was, is still an oversimplification.
How so?
Because the genetic data suggested that attraction doesn't really work on a simple slider, where attraction to one sex decreases as attraction to the other increases.
Not a zero-sum game.
Exactly. The findings indicated you can have genes predisposing you to attraction to men and genes predisposing you to attraction to women simultaneously. Strong attraction to one doesn't preclude strong attraction to another. The 0 to 6 model doesn't quite capture that complexity.
Okay, so if it's not a single gene and the human scale is more complex and fluid, maybe we need to look, like Kinsey did, at that deeper mammalian background, the animal kingdom.
And that's where things get really interesting. The sources just catalog overwhelming evidence of polysexual behavior attraction to multiple sexes across the animal kingdom.
How widespread is it?
Over 450 species documented. Mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, invertebrates, even starfish, giraffes, squid. It's incredibly common.
Which immediately throws up a flag for evolutionary biology, doesn't it? The Darwinian paradox.
Right. The classic paradox is, if evolution favors reproduction, why does same-sex sexual behavior persist? It costs time, energy, and doesn't directly lead to offspring. From a strict reproductive viewpoint, it seems inefficient.
But the sources we looked at offer a really powerful challenge to the assumption baked into that paradox.
They really do. Researcher Julia Monk and her colleagues basically argue the paradox only exists if you start with the unquestioned assumption that exclusive heterosexuality is the original ancestral baseline state.
What do they propose instead?
Monk argues that the most likely ancestral condition for animals was probably indiscriminate sexual behaviors directed to all sexes. In other words, behavioral bisexuality might have been the starting point.
Whoa, okay, that completely reframes it. If that's true, then widespread behavioral bisexuality isn't the anomaly we need to explain.
Exactly. It becomes the default state of nature. And maybe exclusive monosexuality, rigidly preferring only one sex, is the behavioral specialization that actually needs the evolutionary explanation.
And it also suggests that a lot of this non-reproductive sexual behavior isn't even about reproduction, right? It serves other functions.
Totally. It's often simply social activity. Bonding, alliance building, conflict resolution, or, maybe it's just fun, as one source bluntly puts it.
Like the bonobos, they're the classic example of that, aren't they?
The classic example.
Yeah.
Bonobos use widespread sex, much of it non-reproductive, same sex and different sex, to manage social tension. It's literally make love, not war for them. It's about social cohesion, not just making babies.
And this idea that sexual behavior can be driven by circumstance or social need, rather than a fixed internal identity, we see that in human contexts, too, like the prison effect.
Right, the prison effect or the heterosexual deprivation hypothesis. It's the observation that same-sex behavior often increases dramatically in what they call homosocial settings.
Prisons, the military, single-sex boarding schools, places where partners of the opposite sex just aren't available.
Exactly. The sources mention testimony from UK prison staff and depictions like in Orange is the New Black. You hear the phrase, gay for this day.
Describing inmates who engage in same-sex acts purely out of, well, necessity or opportunity while inside.
Yeah, the staff testimony confirms it. Male inmates often engage in sex out of necessity, but then resume exclusively heterosexual relationships the moment they're released.
But here's the crucial point the sources make. The behavior changes dramatically in that situation.
But the core sexual identity often doesn't budge.
So, even when circumstances dictate same-sex activity, the underlying beliefs, the internalized monosexual identity, the maybe even homophobic attitudes, they remain intact.
Yes, as one source puts it, they bring their beliefs with them. The actions are situational, driven by the environment, not necessarily reflecting a change in their fundamental sense of self.
Which brings us back full circle to that distinction we started with. Measuring behavior, whether with a plethysmograph in a lab or observing it in a prison.
Doesn't necessarily tell you anything definitive about a person's enduring identity.
That difficulty in claiming a queer identity publicly, whether you're in prison or just navigating everyday society, it brings us to the whole modern idea of the closet and coming out.
And it's interesting, the sources remind us the phrase coming out originally came from high society, a debutante coming out into society.
Oh, right, like a formal introduction.
Yeah. The shift to the closet metaphor, where you hide something shameful, has actually been criticized because it implicitly reinforces heterosexuality as the normal default state you're hiding from. It frames non-straight identity as the secret, the deviation.
And concealment is a massive global reality, isn't it?
Huge. The estimate cited is that 83% of LGBT plus people worldwide are closeted to some extent.
83%. Wow.
And for people who identify as bi, the barriers to being open can be even higher, often compounded by those pervasive myths and that internalized monosexism we talked about.
We see that toxicity laid bare in that anecdote from the Telegraph's confession column, the anonymous dad.
Oh, that was brutal. His daughter comes out as bi and he just refuses to accept it. Throws all the stereotypes at her.
Yeah.
She's jumping on a woke bandwagon, just seeking attention. It can't be real because she had a boyfriend before.
Just a total refusal to believe that attraction to men and women can coexist in one person. That's a huge barrier right there.
A massive one. And that disbelief, that lack of acceptance, it extends into the professional world too.
How so?
Well, the research shows bisexual individuals report significantly more hesitation about being out at work compared to gay men or lesbians.
Why is that? What's the thinking there?
It often comes down to fearing double discrimination. Potential biphobia from straight colleagues, yes, but also sometimes suspicion or dismissal from gay and lesbian colleagues too, still facing that monosexism from both sides.
And this hesitation, this closeting at work, it actually has a measurable financial cost.
It does. There was a fascinating hiring simulation study in 2017 called To Be or Not to Be.
Clever title. What did it find?
It found that job applicants who openly identified as bisexual received the lowest salary offers, significantly lower.
How much lower?
A 15% salary penalty compared to candidates who didn't disclose their sexuality at all, just being openly bi. cost them money.
15%. That's staggering. So there's a financial penalty. But the sources also detail really serious safety concerns, don't they? The workplace itself isn't always safe.
No, tragically not. One UK sample found 30% of bi people had experienced unwanted touching at work. 30%.
And sexual assault.
21% experienced sexual assault specifically at work. These aren't just abstract risks, they're terrifyingly high rates of actual harm happening in professional environments.
It really underscores that just having a general diversity policy isn't enough. Workplaces need to be explicitly bi-inclusive.
Absolutely. Because that openness, that authenticity, is too often treated by others as somehow an invitation for harassment or assault. The identity itself is misconstrued.
And all this stigma, this exclusion, this lack of safety, it inevitably takes a toll on mental health. The data seems pretty clear on that.
Yeah, the findings are consistent and concerning. Bisexual individuals face comparatively higher risks for serious mental health problems, things like suicidality, severe depression, self-injury, even compared to other sexual minorities.
Why is that? What are the drivers behind that disparity?
Researchers point to 4 key interconnected factors. First, that double discrimination, the monosexism, from both straight and queer communities. Feeling accepted nowhere.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, the higher rates of identity concealment that often result from fearing that discrimination. Hiding who you are is incredibly stressful.
Constantly monitoring yourself.
Exactly. Third, just the relentless drip, drip, drip of microaggressions. Those subtle comments, the jokes, the assumptions that constantly invalidate your identity.
And the fourth driver.
Internalized biphobia. When the world around you, media, maybe even your own friends or family, parts of the queer community constantly tells you your identity isn't real, or it's just a phase, or it's greedy or untrustworthy.
You start to believe it yourself.
It takes a huge psychological toll. You internalize those negative messages, and that can be incredibly damaging.
One of the most disturbing consequences detailed in the sources is the link between how bisexual people, especially women, are hypersexualized and the horrifying rates of sexual violence they experience. The U.S. stats are just awful.
They're devastating. 61%. Nearly 2/3 of bisexual women in the U.S. report experiencing intimate partner rape, physical violence, or stalking in their lifetime.
Compared to 35% for heterosexual women, that difference is enormous.
It's a crisis hidden in plain sight. And a major factor driving it seems to be that very hypersexualization stereotype.
How does that play out?
It leads directly to victim blaming. Studies found that when bi women were victims of violence, other people perceive them as more promiscuous, more responsible for what happened to them.
And even, unbelievably, as having suffered less than lesbian or straight victims of similar assaults.
Exactly. As if their identity somehow made the trauma less real or less impactful. The cultural narrative minimizes their suffering.
And the sources even mention reports of something called corrective rape.
Yes, reported by some U.S. participants in the research. It's this horrific idea where the sexual violence is explicitly motivated by trying to correct the victim's sexuality.
Trying to force them to be fully lesbian or fully straight.
Precisely. It's this terrifying manifestation of monosexism, where the aggressor believes the bi identity itself is fundamentally wrong and needs to be violently eradicated. It shows rejection from both monosexual extremes.
That pervasive rejection, that disbelief, it also shows up in the legal system, particularly for bisexual asylum seekers trying to escape persecution.
Yeah, they face really unique hurdles. They often have to somehow prove their bisexuality to judges or immigration officials, who are often deeply skeptical.
How does that skepticism manifest?
Claims often get rejected because the judge simply doesn't believe them, thinks they're lying.
Correct.
Or, crucially, they argue the person could just choose to be in an opposite-sex relationship and blend in, hide their identity.
Back to that sexual camouflage accusation again.
Exactly. And the result is this dangerous paradox. Bisexual people are actually less likely to get refugee status than gay or lesbian applicants. The system basically says because you could potentially hide, you don't need protection.
Even though hiding your identity to survive is itself a form of persecution.
Precisely. It ties into this legal concept of immutability. In human rights law, a protecting characteristic is usually considered immutable. Either it can't be changed, or you shouldn't be forced to change or conceal it.
Like being forced to convert religions.
Right. And while someone's sexual orientation might evolve over their lifetime, forcing them to hide their bisexual identity to avoid harm should be seen as a fundamental rights violation. But the legal system often struggles with this. focusing too much on concealable behavior and failing to protect the immutable identity.
That paints a pretty bleak picture of the risks and penalties. But the sources don't stop there, do they? They also highlight the positive side, the strengths, the freedoms of a bi identity.
Absolutely. Visibility is key. Like the story of record executive Clive Davis coming out as bi when he was 80 years old. It matters.
Never too late.
Never too late. And researchers have actually gone through and cataloged positive aspects people associate with their bi identity. There are like 11 distinct themes identified.
11. What's the main takeaway?
When you boil it all down, the single biggest theme that emerges across all those positive aspects is freedom.
Freedom. Freedom from what?
Freedom from restrictive social labels, for one. Freedom to love who you love without worrying about their sex or gender. Freedom to explore different kinds of relationships, different attractions as they might shift over time, without shame.
And freedom to just be yourself.
Exactly. Freedom of sexual expression. And maybe the biggest one, the freedom to live authentically, honestly. In a world that constantly tries to erase or pathologize you, choosing to claim that identity is inherently an act of radical self-acceptance and liberation. Tag outro.
So what this deep dive really shows us, I think, is this profound mismatch between maybe biological reality and social acceptance.
Yeah. Bisexuality clearly isn't some modern trend whipped up by magazines. It has this long, complex history, even if so much of it has been systematically erased.
And scientifically, it challenges our neat binaries. Whether you look at Kinsey finding endless intergradation or the evolutionary biologists suggesting behavioral bisexuality might actually be the ancestral norm in nature.
Yet we've seen the heavy cost of that fluidity in the modern world. Very real penalties, financial, physical, psychological, often driven by that double discrimination, that monosexism, coming from both straight and queer communities.
Which means the conversation definitely isn't over, because visibility is still a huge issue, isn't it?
Still lacking. The source mentioned only about 7% of out-elected officials globally identify as bi, pan, or queer. That identity needs to be much more visible, more normalized in our media, in education, in law, in politics.
Our whole exploration today kind of flips the script. Instead of seeing bisexuality as this confusing deviation from the norm.
But maybe we should seriously consider that evolutionary hypothesis, that being behaviorally open to multiple sexes might have been the original state, and exclusive monosexuality was the later development, the divergence.
So we'll leave you, the listener, with this final thought to chew on. Given how much our worldview seems built on this monosexual bias, this assumption about what's fixed, what's natural, what other fundamental assumptions might you be holding on to? Assumptions that maybe don't reflect, as Kinsey put it, behavior as it actually occurs in the human being.
Discovering the reality of fluidity really does challenge us all.